Hey, how you doing? Arthur Wu here, and today we're going to be talking about merging the creative and the technical, how to use the tools to drive your creative vision. Let's get to it. So I don't know how many projects I've worked on through the years where I've tried to attempt color grading the image, but the just didn't know what I was doing. I mean, to be quite honest with you, I would push and pull knobs and sliders and not be able to repeat what I did on the next project, even though I was able to get it to look somewhat decent. And the thing that really changed everything for me was being able to use some of the more technical tools in order to guide some of the creative choices that I really wanted to make. And I want to talk about today the RGB parade. So when we think about color grading, we really think about Hollywood movies, we think about music videos and like these amazing grades, these colors, really great skin tones. And but I think a lot of what gets lost in that is the color correction process, which is kind of the basis for everything, in my opinion. And before you can run, you have to learn how to walk and crawl, so to speak, where you have to learn some of the basics in order to build on that foundation and to do the more advanced things. And to me, having a good color correction foundation is everything. So let's talk about the RGB parade here. Now, I'm working in Premiere, so even though I prefer Davinci Resolve for some of the more comprehensive tools, the more detailed tools, I think that Premiere, when you're pushing out projects as an independent filmmaker or an editor who just wants to make their images look decent, Lumetri tools have come a long way. And so we want to stick with this just to give people a good base, because the RGB parade exists in, I think, all of the tools where you can monitor what's happening in your image, which helps you drive your creative vision. And so let's talk about this for a little bit. It goes from 0, the shadows, to 100 IRE, which is the highlights. And each section represents what's happening in the image. So, the top here represents the highlights, the middle zone represents the mids, and then the shadows are represented in this lower area. And by kind of analyzing what's happening here, you can make decisions on where to push and pull those sliders and knobs in your tools in order to make the image look a certain way. So let's apply that to this image. You can see it's super yellow, super green. The first thing in the color correction process, I think, aside from exposure balance, is the color balance. And that has to do with making your image have a nice white balance. So I'm in the color tab in Premiere, and the first thing I'm going to do is go to the basic correction in the Lumetri color effect here. And the easiest thing to do is basically select white balance selector, and then you pick whatever you think your white area is going to be. And boom, it automatically adjusts the temperature and the tint to make these areas white, and it affects the other parts of the image. And this is super powerful. You can see here that I didn't really have to do anything. I just had to click a button. So let's look at the Lumetri scopes, the RGB parade, to kind of see what happened there. So I'm going to take this effect off, and you can see that to start with, the highlights, these white areas here, tons of green in them. You can see there's like a little bit of red in there, and then like there's basically no blue, which is why the image is so greenish yellow. It has kind of none of the blue tones in order to even it out. But as soon as I apply that white balance here, look what happens. Your highlights get a little bit more even. The blue is now forced into this image, into the highlights, and then it becomes more neutral. It's pretty powerful stuff, because now you can start to see what the tools are doing. Whereas before, if you didn't have the Lumetri scopes up there, you were just randomly picking buttons. You have no idea what's happening in the rest of the image. So by using these scopes here, it's already informing you of what's happening. Now, when I did that, let's undo that again. You can see here the shadows are somewhat neutral. So if we look it down here, you can see the shadows, they're kind of lining up. There's maybe a little bit of red in them, but for the most part, they're lining up. But as soon as I applied this here, what happened is the concept of the push and pull. In color, when you push or pull a certain knob or a certain slider, you're generally going to be affecting something else in the color space. And so here, when I've pushed the blue into the highlights, you can start to see here, the blues got lifted. And then the red got slightly lifted. And so what's happening is that now I'm getting a little bit of a wash in my shadows. I can kind of just see that from my eye from just looking at the image. So before and after, you can kind of see. It's a little bit more blue now. Okay, well, how do I fix that? Well, now I have to get it into a little bit more of an intermediate type of tool where, this white balance selector isn't really going to help me out too much. It's only really going to help me get to this white, these white areas. But if I really wanted to kind of neutralize some of these shadows, maybe I wanted to take some of the green out of this floor as well. It's still looking a little green to me. Maybe I want it to be a little warm. Well, I'm going to close that down. I'm going to go to the color wheels. And this is a little bit more of an advanced tool, maybe more of an intermediate tool, I should say. But this, when I first started doing these, looking at color tutorials, not really understanding what I was doing, seeing all these colorists use the color wheels, I was like, all right, I'm gonna be like these colorists. I'm gonna use these wheels and like, call myself a colorist. But I really had no idea what I was doing because, without the tool, how are you gonna know what you're pushing and pulling into your image? You just don't. And so going back to my scopes here, um, you can start to see that. Okay, well, let's look at the shadows first, right? Let's try to neutralize that a little bit. And typically, here's the shadow control. When you have when you want to take color out, you usually go in the opposite direction of it. Okay, so if I wanted to take some of the blue out of the shadows here, I'm gonna go in the opposite direction and see what happens here. I'm gonna just pull that with the mouse. And look at that. The parade is now moving a little bit. Oh, I went a little too far, but here you can start to see that now I'm taking some of that blue out. Look, it's more neutral now, automatically more neutral. Let's add some of that a little bit back in just to make the line a little bit more even. A little bit hard because I'm using my mouse here, so it's not super accurate, but look at that. Um, it's now much more neutral. It's more of a black now than that kind of like that bluish tint there. And then now you can start to see that let's analyze the mids. Let's maybe try to get some of this green out of the image. You can start to see here, maybe in my mids area, it's about, there's a lot of green in around 40. And there's almost red almost is touching that, and there's not a lot of blue. So that's telling me that maybe I want to push some blue and some red into my image here. And let's just do a little bit of that. And as you can start just to see the recording here, I'm pushing a little bit of red in, I'm pushing a little bit of blue in, and it's making it a little bit warmer. It's kind of nice. So if I undo that, you start to see that it's starting to take the green out a little bit, adding a little bit of red. Not quite, but if I wanted to keep tweaking it, I could. I can continually go in this direction. But look what happens to the shadows. As I'm pushing this, I have to pull some of the color back out because as I'm raising the mids here in the blue and the red, it's also raising that in the shadows. So I'm gonna have to go in the opposite direction, take some of that red out, take some of that blue out, and I'm back into this image here. So you can, at this point, it's really just personal preference. I bet you've balanced the image out. The whites are nice, the shadows are nice, and then everything in between, you can kind of apply with a little bit more of the advanced tools. It's really your preference at this point. But I just kind of wanted to show you guys using some of these tools to kind of get started with just simple color correction is very powerful. Now, another thing you could do is use the sliders here to raise or lower the mids or the shadows or the highlights. And here we're about at probably like a 5 IRE. It looks about a 5. The shadows are a little bit lifted. Now, this is a very popular look right now, like the lifted shadows, quote unquote, more cinematic look. But let's just say you want more contrast. If you want it like rich, deep shadows, which I typically tend to like. If you go down to maybe like, 2 or 3, if I'm pulling this down here, that's what this is doing. Look what happened. I'm going to undo that and then redo that. And look at the difference. Lifted shadows, dark shadows. And again, this is completely has to do with preference. It's neither here nor there. Some of you might prefer the lifted shadows. Some of you might like the darker shadows. And that's basically it. So, using these scopes here, you can automatically see that you're empowered much more to make those creative decisions of, I want lower shadows. Well, how much lower do you want them? You obviously don't want them less than 0 because then you're going to be crushing the details. So how much lower do you know how much you want lower you want them? And the answer is yes when you're using a certain tool, because now you're within the parameters of the luminance scale here. So, that is basically merging the creative with the technical. Hope that gave you guys a good understanding of kind of how to move forward with that and having a more systematic approach rather than just going in there, selecting random LUTs, pushing and pulling the knobs and the sliders in random directions and hoping for the best. Because I did that for too many months and years on, I was able to get some decent looking stuff out of them, but I was never able to recreate them. And it wasn't until I started really understanding these tools that it was like, okay, now I'm getting a good grasp of how to understand this. So going back to the beginning, oh man, super green, lifted shadows, it's just a unbalanced image, and then boom, much more balanced image. So if you have any questions, post them below. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one, guys. All right, peace.